So despite the dozens of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. videos and rankings I have on this channel, I've never actually done anything where I rank all of the main villains and antagonists of the show. But Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. constantly did different things in different arcs, and sometimes people were villains for half a season and not the full season, and rarely did the show have one main villain for an entire season. Like, the show switched back and forth between who it considered the core villain at any point in time. So in this video, I'm only using people who I believe were a main villain for a certain point of the show or a certain arc of the show. I'm not using Cal, for example, because in my opinion he was never a main villain at any point during season 2. He kind of had just 1 or 2 episodes where he was an antagonist for S.H.I.E.L.D., but mostly he was just working with someone else who was a bigger villain. I'm not counting Deadlock either, for the same reasons. In season 1 he was always kind of under someone else, and Reyna is not on here for exactly the same reasons. So if there are villains you're surprised aren't counted on this list, that's probably why, but if there's any you point out and are like, well, this character is on the list for this reason, that means that this other character should also be on this list, then definitely let me know, I'd love to know. But with that said, there are 15 different characters or groups that are going to be on this list, and that's a lot, so I'm not going to spend overly long on any of them. But anyway, here's number 15. So Nathaniel Malek, Sybil, and the Chronicoms. And for the purpose of not having a super long list, I combined all of Season 7's villains into one rank. And in general, I find these characters a little disappointing. Honestly, the villains were easily my least favourite thing about the final season. Like, I think the season is good, I love most of it, but I really felt like having most of the villains be leftovers from season 6 and then bringing in a Malek who wasn't nearly as good as Gideon combined to make somewhat of an underwhelming final group for the show to take down, especially when compared to a lot of villains from the early seasons. These just don't really hold up. But honestly, the episodes that barely used Nathaniel were among my favourite of the season. I felt like when Nathaniel was the focus, the season wasn't nearly as good as when he was kind of just in the background. For 14, I have Eli Morrow, and he was the antagonist for the very first arc of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Season 4, and I think he was fine, honestly. Like, genuinely, when it comes to Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., they actually very rarely had a main antagonist that I just straight up didn't like. But the reason Eli is so low is because, in my opinion, he's maybe the most uninteresting part of this arc. Robbie Reyes is amazing, Daisy's storyline is great, seeing where all of our favourite characters are after Season 3 really shook up the dynamic was really fun, and Eli is a fine villain, but he's sort of the last thing you mention when talking about how great these early episodes are. You're like, oh, I love this, I love this, I love this. Oh, and yeah, Eli was there as well. For 13, I have Anton Ivanov, or the Superior. And for the character of Anton, we're getting into kind of shaky territory on whether he belongs on this list or not. The character was an antagonist for some of the middle episodes of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., leading the Watchdogs after they were introduced in Season 3, and he also returned working under Hale in Season 5. And the reason I think Anton should be included here is due to the fact that even though he was working with Ada and Radcliffe, he was almost certainly working against Coulson with Radcliffe and Ada just kind of there. Later on in Season 4, he was definitely more of a pawn, but for those early parts, it felt like he was an antagonist that stood in his own right. I really like the actor who plays him, but overall I do think Anton's one of those characters that's a little forgotten about, since so much other great stuff is happening during Season 4. Okay, so full disclosure, completely forgot about Hale and Ruby until I'd already scripted and recorded this video, but Hale and Ruby would go here between 13 and 12. I didn't love them. At this point, the Hydra thing was kind of a little old, which is why I think I wasn't really too into Hale, because we'd already had 4 full seasons of Hydra being a crucial antagonist, and then Ruby just wanting to be Daisy wasn't the most interesting motivation for her character. I feel like a lot of the surrounding elements of Season 5 were a lot better, and a lot of the surrounding antagonists for Season 5 were a lot better, but this is where they'd go on the list, so yeah, sorry I don't have more to say on them. For 12, I have Andrew Garner and Lash. I was honestly really hesitant to include Garner on this list because he was kind of a complete last-second addition to it, but I think Andrew had enough episodes in early Season 3 with the S.H.I.E.L.D. team going after him to really justify being on this list, definitely in comparison to like Rosalind and the ATCU that pretty much only had an episode that were them properly against S.H.I.E.L.D., but I think the actual Lash stuff is underwhelming, feels kind of like a generic Monster of the Week character. The real stuff that makes the villain stand out is how sinister Andrew is when he's not Lash, showing that he's like this even in his human form and not blacking out when he becomes Lash. Seeing the little paranoid flashes he'd have of killing Inhumans while he was training them really did work well and made the character feel incredibly fun to watch. I think it would have gotten better if he stuck around as a cool anti-hero style character, working with S.H.I.E.L.D., with maybe how he handles things, putting him on the opposite side of their morality. I think if the scenes we had of him were more focused on Andrew and what Andrew was like when he was now kind of being evil, that would have been a lot better, rather than having so much of it be devoted to the Monster of the Week thing with Lash. But Lash did look really cool, like the visual effects on that character were really cool, and his effects when he'd kill an Inhuman or a character were really cool as well. For 11, I have Cassius, Sonara, and just the Kree from early Season 5 in general, because I'm pretty much counting all of the early Season 5 antagonists here. Cassius was a creepy villain, and he was played very well, but similar to some of the earlier villains on this list, I feel like the great stuff about early Season 5 really concerned his character. Like, I loved seeing the SHIELD team try and survive both on the surface and within the grey areas of the Lighthouse survivors. I loved everything to do with space. But when it came to actually having a main antagonist in the shape of Cassius, I felt like it was just sort of generically there. Like, if the antagonist for early Season 5 was just the Kree in general as the villains, with no real figurehead, everything probably would have played out more or less the same, and my enjoyment of the season might not have changed too much. The only times I really felt threatened by the character was towards the very end of the arc, when it became clear he had future knowledge of our characters. Sonara was really cool with her abilities, but similar to Lash, it felt like somewhat of a generic character of the week than anything that majorly stood out as a character in her own right. Like, we barely knew anything about her, and then she was already finished with. In 10th place, I have Hive, and Hive is one of those villains I do often forget about. I think it's because he's wearing the face of Grant Ward, so it's easy to think of him as an extension of Ward, but also because Gideon is such a force in early Season 3, played by Powers Booth incredibly well, it's easy to forget that Gideon wasn't the main villain for almost half of that season. I felt like Hive was a bit of a weird villain. He felt like the first extremely comic booky main villain that the show used in terms of his abilities, but also how he went about things. Like, there are some fight scenes with the character at the very end of Season 3 that feel much more stunt focused and superpower based than the show usually had. I think Hive could have and should have been a much stronger villain, but he also has one of the best defeats and death scenes in the entire show, which is that scene between him and Lincoln in the Quinjet above Earth. Like, that's a top 10 scene in the entire show. In 9th, I have Izel and Sarge, and for this one I'm counting Izel and Sarge as one, because I do think Sarge was a much stronger character than Izel, but they do kind of come hand in hand. Clark Gregg played this morally ambiguous and borderline scary version of Coulson really well, but Season 6 in general is a season that I always have a somewhat opinion of until I rewatch it, and then I'm like, oh, this is actually some pretty good stuff. That said, I do think Izel is one of the weaker main villains to come out of the show, and it feels like she doesn't get enough time to be developed or utilized the way some others do on this list. Her main theme is great though, and it's one of the best of the show.
What is it?
I don't know. I think it means we're too late.
In 8th, I have Jiaying, Inhumans, and just Gordon, though just kind of the Inhumans from Afterlife in general. And Jiaying and Gordon and her Inhumans becoming the final antagonists of Season 2, they came pretty late and pretty fast at the end of the season, which I think is why they're not even higher on this list, because they did have potential to be some of the best in the show. But what we did get was really well done. Jiaying presented a pretty integral conflict for Skye, probably becoming Daisy and later on Quake. The character was given an impossible choice of choosing her blood family and the people she shares her abilities with, or her found family and the people who took her in and truly care for her. And besides this, we also had the Mac, Fitz and Coulson versus Gordon fight scene, which is not just fantastic, but it gave us the best Mac scene in the entire show.
It's Gordon, right? And you are? I'm the guy who kills Gordon.
In 7th, I have Gideon Malik, and bringing back a character from Avengers 1 who had the tiniest of cameos in Avengers 1 was a really interesting choice for the show, but it worked well because it meant Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. got to use Powers Booth. And Gideon was a well-written character, but I feel like he wouldn't have been nearly as strong without Powers playing it. One of the interesting things that early S.H.I.E.L.D. did was give us kind of a different major figure in Hydra every season, and almost all of them felt incredibly different. Like, Gideon represented this more sophisticated real-world view of the organization, and seeing him realize that bringing Hive to Earth was the worst decision he could have made felt like a realization that rarely see Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. villains come to. In 6th, I have Daniel Whitehall, and I'm kind of counting a lot of the early Season 2 antagonists for this one, like Bakshi and Agent 33 and just his whole Hydra faction in general, because I do feel like they were sort of complete extensions of Whitehall's character for the first half of Season 2, but I think Whitehall was a really good villain, and it felt like a great change and shake-up to the kind of Hydra leader we saw Gareth to be in Season 1, Gareth being someone who didn't really actually care a whole lot about Hydra or what it's about, whereas Whitehall was completely different, someone who was very dedicated to making Hydra into a serious and fearsome organization in present day, someone who was literally with Hydra at the very beginning, while Gareth was someone who joined up very late just because it suited him. Whitehall was a creepy villain, and his brainwashing techniques added this sense of worry to the show in early Season 2, like we were worried about Simmons or any of our characters getting captured by him. In 5th, I have John Garrett, or the Clairvoyant, and Garrett is another villain that wouldn't have been nearly as fun to watch without Bill Paxton's amazing performance. Like, there was a huge charm to his character there, despite how horrible he was. You had a lot of fun watching him being a villain, and he was the first real betrayal we saw our characters face through this character, since he was revealed just a little bit before Ward was. And in the back half of the season, when we see him and Ward work together and have this villainous dynamic, it works really well, and he really set the tone for what the show would be, because he really comes into the limelight in the last set of episodes of season 1, which those are the episodes that I think are the decider on if S.H.I.E.L.D. is a show for you or not, and Garrett is a villain that amplifies that. In 4th place, I have Glenn Talbot, or Graviton. Talbot becoming Graviton was definitely something a lot of us weren't expecting, but the fact he was built up over 5 seasons as someone who started as just this annoying military general going after S.H.I.E.L.D., to someone who begrudgingly works with them to try and get Hydra, to someone who's a genuine ally and trusts Coulson and his team, was great. Seeing him captured by Hale and screaming, saying that Coulson and S.H.I.E.L.D. are going to find him and save him is really tragic. Like, it showed how far his character came and how by season 5 he was legitimately on S.H.I.E.L.D.'s side. Seeing him fall to becoming Graviton just makes this all the more tragic, but having the history we had with the character is why he made such a compelling villain. Like, we wanted Daisy to somehow get through to him in that final fight, that maybe he could still be saved, and it worked fantastically well. Like, he was a really good villain to cap off that first 5 seasons of S.H.I.E.L.D., especially since at the time we thought S.H.I.E.L.D. might end with season 5. In 3rd place, I have Leopold Fitz, or the Doctor, and I understand if certain people don't think the Doctor should be on this list, but I think he more than made a case for why he's one of the best antagonists on the show, played amazingly by Ian. This evil what-if framework version of Fitz was an absolute force to be reckoned with, getting to be around for the last set of episodes in season 4, and then getting 1 episode in season 5 and 1 episode in season 6. This was part of an extreme mental break that Fitz was experiencing, and seeing his reaction to what he did as the Doctor as soon as he came out of the framework is another one of those "oh, this is amazing" moments that S.H.I.E.L.D. had. In 2nd place, I have Ada, Ophelia, or Madame Hydra. Mallory Jansen played 4 different characters in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Season 4, being the robotic Ada, the real-life Agnes, the framework combination of the two giving us Madame Hydra, and then the Inhuman version we got in the final 2 episodes, who was Ophelia. And every single one of them felt different to the last, with Madame Hydra being this terrifying, unstoppable force controlling our characters in the framework, while her Ophelia version in real life afterwards being potentially the scariest character and villain in the entire show, unable to control her emotions and what she's feeling, just completely lashing out at everyone and everything around her. And she's on par, in my opinion, with the best Marvel villains like Kingpin, Thanos, and Kilgrave, but I feel like there's one villain that beats her out, and that is Grant Ward. And Grant is one of the best characters on the show for me. One of the most layered, one of the most interesting. Brett Dalton brought a ton to the role, and seeing him grow throughout seasons 1, 2, and 3, sometimes being a full-blown antagonist, sometimes being an uneasy ally, it's all fantastic. His later season 2 moments and early season 3 moments where he's in full-blown villain mode are incredible, and I think that what makes this character stand out is not just because he's built up over a couple of seasons, but because of the connections he has to the rest of the cast. Everyone on the cast in seasons 2 and seasons 3 has a reason to want Grant dead and want a reason to go after him, and that makes every moment and every interaction he has from season 2 onwards feel so intense, so charged, so well written, so well acted. I know some people got sick of Grant eventually, but I don't know, I could have done with 7 seasons of him, honestly. But that's how I'd rank the villains of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Do you agree or disagree? How would you rank them? Are there any on here you think I shouldn't have included? Let me know all of that. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I hope you have an amazing day.